Hello, time once again for a Fireside Chat. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Licciardello.
Thank you for being with us on the ABC News channel and ABC News Radio, as well as iView and online. This week, the protests over the police killing of George Floyd continue.
We're going to get a legal opinion on what's going on there and what might happen next.
We'll also look at the impact it's having on the 2020 presidential election.
And we'll be getting the latest on the impact of the coronavirus pandemic as well. But first...
A memorial service has been held in Minneapolis today for George Floyd, the 46-year-old whose death last week at the hands of police triggered protests and, in some cases, rioting and arson unseen in America in half a century. Black Lives Matter protests continue across the United States, while nighttime looting has been generally brought under control in recent days by more coordinated police action and evening curfews. President Trump was accused of inflaming the situation on Tuesday when he called for domination and overwhelming force against protesters, threatening to unleash the might of the US military if local police and National Guard troops were unable to restore order.
We will end it now. Today, I have strongly recommended to every governor to deploy the National Guard in sufficient numbers that we dominate the streets. Mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence has been quelled. If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
Pretty intense rhetoric there, John.
Absolutely.
But I think I know what he was going for. Because according to a Morning Consult poll this week, on the day that he made his announcement, even though 54% of people approved of the protesters and 22% opposed the protesters, 66% of people supported calling out the National Guard to ensure public safety, and 55% of people supported deploying the military.
Yeah, and worth pointing out here that the National Guard, it's kind of like the Army Reserve, but it's usually under the command of state governments, but it can be federalised if the government in Washington thinks that they need to coordinate it, and that happens from time to time, but not often.
No, but in this case, it was just weird how ambivalent people were. They supported the protesters.
Yep.
They also supported security.
Yeah, I guess a lot of people were very worried. And it was just minutes before making that historic threat that a peaceful protest in Lafayette Park, which is just over the road from the White House, was suddenly broken up on the orders, reportedly, of Attorney General William Barr. The White House had also reportedly pushed to take control of the DC police force to quell the protest during the day, but the mayor of DC refused. Instead, the feds could only use the Drug Enforcement Agency, the Department of Homeland Security, and even Park Police to deploy against the protesters. And that did look an awful lot like a disproportionate response, given that they, it seems, Chaz, just cleared the park so that President Trump could then walk over the road to St John's Episcopal Church to stage what amounted to a photo opportunity.
Yeah, but before we go on, can I just point out what prompted those moves was, in my view, some pretty fake news. And that was, first of all, you might recall people were questioning Trump's courage over, they said that the White House turned off its lights, which it did, that's true. But the thing that gave that story legs was a fake photo that got spread around the internet. This photo right there, that photo is from 2015. And they artificially darkened it.
It was Obama doing it.
It was Obama hiding in the bunker. Look, that photo turned up all over the place. And it's true, they did turn off many of the White House lights, but they do that every night at 11 p.m, by the way.
Right.
I don't know how many more lights they turned off than normal, but this is what actually is the real photo, I think, if you're interested. A few more lights than the one that was going around the internet, getting people going, oh, what a coward. Even worse, there was that bunker boy story. You know, the president copped heaps because they said, oh, the Secret Service, they bundled him down to a bunker. The truth is they moved him to a secure location after multiple people crossed the perimeters that they'd set up. And that's fair enough. That's the Secret Service's job to do that. It's not like Trump asked for them to do that. And I just wish Trump didn't constantly make up excuses, like saying in this case, I was just inspecting the secure location. Like, you know, the schoolyard bravado is so lame. But anyway, I don't think it's a coincidence that Trump wanted to show he was a tough guy after those two stories.
Yeah, I guess the only counter to that is, why is the president wanting to show himself as a tough guy?
I know.
Because, you know, any normal president would have said, I thank the Secret Service for their concern. At no point did I feel as though I was in danger. It was wonderful to see their professionalism. This is protocol. This is what we do. And the visit to the church as well. I mean, in terms of the photo opportunity, I don't have a big problem with that as well. People of the Christian faith, some have said, well, that's not appropriate, but presidents have been going to St John's Episcopal Church for over 200 years. Yeah. It is often used as this is a Christian president, kind of a prop. It's not the first time it's been used as a prop. But the very fact that before the curfew, there's a 7 p.m. curfew, 6:25, send in the troops to push all of the peaceful protesters out of Lafayette Park, just so that he could then give his 5-minute address in the Rose Garden and then take half the family and his cabinet members and stride across the road. Now, again, another normal, more considered president, not wanting to inflame a situation, would have maybe done that the next morning.
Yeah.
After the curfew had come in at 7 o'clock, yes, then the remaining protesters are breaking the law. They should be moved on rather than tear gassed or shot with rubber bullets. And then he goes to church in the morning after having told the people in the church that he's coming. Is that okay? Rather than just springing it on them.
Yeah, he could have done it half an hour later.
Absolutely.
And it would have been fine because the curfew was about to kick in.
So is that incompetence or is that deliberately inflaming the situation? That's the unresolved question in my mind.
Well, if he was deliberately inflaming the situation, it backfired badly.
Yeah.
As we're about to find out.
I think you're right. The president's handling of the protests and the unrest this week has prompted an extraordinary attack from the former Defence Secretary, General James Mattis, who has remained silent since leaving the Trump administration 18 months ago. Well, this week he wrote, "Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not pretend to try instead. He tries to divide us. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years without mature leadership." Whoa.
Wow, yeah.
To which the president responded, not that maturely.
Probably the only thing Barack Obama and I have in common is that we both had the honor of firing Jim Mattis, the world's most overrated general. I asked for his letter of resignation and felt great about it.
Way to confirm it.
I know. Well, that tweet inspired the president's former chief of staff, another general, John Kelly, to defend Jim Mattis as a, quote, honourable man. He called Trump's Twitter attack, quote, nasty, and then he set the record straight. The president did not fire Mattis. Mattis resigned without being asked to. And then the boot comes in. The president has clearly forgotten how it actually happened or is confused. Well, President Trump wasn't going to stand for that, Chaz.
Stop
he
digging!
Shot back on
Stop
Twitter.
digging!
John Kelly didn't know I was going to fire James Mattis, nor did he have any knowledge of me asking for a letter of resignation. Why would I tell him? He was not in my inner circle, was totally exhausted by the job, and in the end just slinked away into obscurity. They all want to come back for a piece of the limelight.
So that is a fairly big deal. Meanwhile, Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska is also speaking out against the president today, saying that she is struggling over whether to support Trump for re-election. She said General Mattis's words were true and honest and necessary and overdue. Then she added she feels that they are getting to the point where, quote, we can be more honest with the concerns that we might hold internally and have the courage of our own convictions to speak up. And more frequent Trump critic Mitt Romney chipped in as well, praising Jim Mattis. He's an individual whose judgment I respect, and I think the world of him. What a wonderful, wonderful man, says Mitt Romney. Now, it's not just former senior staff members or never Trumpers that are piling on at the moment. The president's current Defence Secretary, Mark Esper, also broke publicly with the president this week, remarkably defying Trump's call to use the military to stifle the protests and unrest. Have a look.
The option to use active duty forces in a law enforcement role should only be used as a matter of last resort and only in the most urgent and dire of situations. We are not in one of those situations now. I do not support invoking the Insurrection Act.
And that, Chaz, ironically added up to about as close to an insurrection against President Trump that we've seen to date.
Yeah, look, I think the problem for the Trump administration is this, that Donald Trump, when he's trying to act like a tough guy, and we've established he was trying to act like a tough guy because they questioned his courage and he was trying to respond. He has a tendency to overreach, to go for something big, just to test it out, to see how people feel about it. And then he doesn't necessarily grab it, he doesn't necessarily go for it, he just floats it out there and then just leaves it. We saw that just last week with the Antifa thing, about him saying that he'd declare Antifa a terrorist organisation.
Yep.
Never heard again from that. He just threw it out there.
Yep.
People said, well, that's illegal, you can't do that. He doesn't care, he just threw it out there,
Yep.
whatever. And he threw out one of them with the Insurrection Act as well. Just going, I might just get the military to just
I think
turn
you're
up.
right. And his supporters who are hearing that on Fox News or on Rush Limbaugh's radio show, they're just going to go, yeah, he did that.
Yeah,
he probably did that.
And that's fine, no problems, except for that's an invisible line for the military. The military, they don't take that lightly at all. That for them is, you never cross the line of mixing up the military with civilians, because then that politicises the military, and that's the one thing that they are deathly
Well, they didn't even like the
scared
idea of being sent down to the southern border to get involved in intercepting illegal immigrants, much less being let loose on their own citizens.
And so even though I don't think Trump was ever actually serious about that, and I don't think it was actually a legitimate threat, I think the military just freaked out. And that's why you get Mattis, and that's why you get now the Kelly, the generals pile on. That's why you get Mike Mullen, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. All of them came out. All of them have been very quiet. They all came out this week because of this. And also, most importantly of all, John, that's why you get James Miller.
Who's that then?
James Miller.
What?
He's a member of the Defence Science Board, which I didn't even know existed until this week. But he resigned over this. And
we're going to miss him.
Once we find out who he is. But the reason why this complete nobody might have actually been the most important of all of them was because when he resigned with flair, with a personal attack on Mark Esper. He wrote, I swore an oath of office to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and to bear true faith and allegiance to the same. You, Mark Esper, recited that same oath, but I believe that you violated that oath. President Trump's actions Monday night violated his oath to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, as well as the First Amendment right of the people peaceably to assemble. You may not have been able to stop President Trump from directing this appalling use of force, but you could have chosen to oppose it. Instead, you visibly supported it. I must now ask, if last night's blatant violations do not cross the line for you, what will? That got published in the Washington Post the day before Mark Esper held his press conference, where he contradicted Trump in a massive way.
So you think there's cause and effect there?
I think it might be related. We don't know for sure, but I think it might be related. And then Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany indicated exactly how much Trump enjoyed that press conference from Mark Esper.
Does the president still have confidence in Secretary Esper?
I would say if he loses confidence in Secretary Esper, I'm sure you all will be the first to know.
But as of right now, he still does?
As of right now, Secretary Esper is still Secretary Esper, and should the president lose faith, we will all learn about that in the future.
So, John, maybe even a James Miller-shaped butterfly flapping its wings can create amazing things. By the way, he hasn't just lost the military either. He's losing some religious people as well, which was surprising because the Bible thing and going to the Catholic Church.
It's the wrong Bible.
And it was backwards and upside down. But leaving that aside, on Wednesday you talked about the Episcopal bishop, the Catholic bishop, both speaking out against him.
Yep.
It got way worse. He even lost Pat Robertson.
And it seems like now is the time to say, I understand your pain. I want to comfort you. I think it's time we love each other. But the president took a different course. He said, I am the president of law and order. And he issued a heads up. He said, I'm ready to send in military troops if the nation's governors don't act to quell the violence that has rocked American city. As a matter of fact, he spoke of them as being jerks. You just don't do that, Mr. President. It isn't cool.
And John, if there's one guy who knows about cool,
Pat Robertson.
it's Pat Robertson.
Who's blamed every hurricane on God's wrath against homosexuals for the last 40 years.
He's like the Fonz.
When you've lost Pat Robertson. But that's interesting because evangelicals do not like the version of the Bible that Trump was holding.
Oh.
It's the old version. They like the new version. And again, that was kind of seen as
so many problems.
Maybe this guy isn't really a true evangelical. The questions are being asked there. Interesting time.
If that's not enough problems, there's one more. And that is a tactic that the White House goes for a lot when there's a controversy, and this was definitely becoming a controversy, is to take something where there's a point of disagreement, usually where the media have overreached, and really focus on that and try and separate the media from the rest of America, play them off against each other, and have a situation where his supporters then go, yeah, media, you're bad. Media get defensive, like they do, and then it creates a partisan situation. And if it's a partisan situation, it becomes part of the circus. We move on from the controversy, no problems.
Right.
In this case, they did that about tear gas. You mentioned tear gassing before.
Yep.
Okay, it seems that, according to the Park Police, no one used tear gas. They used smoke canisters, some of which may have caused irritation, but they weren't actual tear gas, right?
Right.
And then the media doubled down on that, go, no, it was tear gas. I was there. I got tear gas. And then the officials said, no, it wasn't tear gas. And they made a big deal out of whether it was tear gas or not.
Right.
Now, the problem with that is that they admitted they used pepper bullets, which have a very similar effect. It creates irritation for the eyes. It's not as bad as tear gas, but it creates the irritation that people described. And so you have them fighting over whether it was pepper bullets or tear gas. And the result of this is what people were seeing on their news coverage.
The U.S. Park Police says their officers did not deploy tear gas at Lafayette Park, but acknowledge using smoke canisters and pepper balls that contain a chemical designed to irritate the eyes. After declaring himself the law and order president, President Trump praised himself for overwhelming force and domination on city streets, and then thanked himself.
I don't think that's a winning message, John. I really don't. Okay, so this sounds like a massive story now over something that started off so trivial and insignificant. Do you think this is actually damaging to Trump?
Potentially, well, damaging, I'm not sure about, because Teflon Don, we really don't know what is going to stick.
Always 43%.
I think it's defining, if not damaging, for Donald Trump. I'm not sure that there is a single mind in the United States that is currently not made up when it comes to President Donald Trump. And there's a poll just earlier today that said that only 1% of voters think that they might change their mind between now and November. People are locked in. Yeah, and I don't know whether people who do change their mind ultimately know it 5 months out or not. But still, there are not a lot of people that haven't got their mind made up about Donald Trump. So, look, it is a pretty extraordinary scene. The optics of this, which was meant to be Donald Trump, master of television, manufacturing this sort of bold gesture of he speaks in the Rose Garden, then he says, and I'm going to a very special place, and he heads over to the church with his family and his cabinet members. Meant to be a bold gesture of defiance, I'm not cowed, etc. Could have been done in a unifying way, could have been done in a non-confrontational way. It was done in a pretty slapdash way, and in a way that the optics actually panned out badly. It was badly stage managed. And for all Trump's strengths as a candidate, time and time again as a candidate in 2016, he actually had really bad advance people. He had really bad advice for what you were going to do, what was going to look well. He still, played incredibly well on free media and he got a lot of free airtime, but he did a lot of dumb stuff in front of cameras. This was a pretty dumb thing to do on camera. And end of the day, he, whether it was gas canisters, smoke canisters, pepper balls, rubber bullets, which are bullets with rubber tips. Study this week said 15% of people shot with rubber bullets can die from them. So it's it's pretty serious, pretty serious indeed. So yeah, I don't think it played in his favour.
Yeah. Now, well, before we move on, just a protest update. The last few days began poorly, as John said before, with some horrible videos of police lashing out. And some even more horrible videos showing why the police were so on edge in the first place.
That's a fucking cop!
That cop was okay. Well, I'm sure he was injured, but he was alive. He walked to the ambulance. That was from Monday night, which was a horrible night overall. 6 officers shot, 4 in St. Louis alone. New York was a looting mecca that night, prompting this extraordinary spray from Andrew Cuomo.
The NYPD and the mayor did not do their job last night. I believe that. Use the police, protect property and people. Look at the videos. It was a disgrace.
Andrew Cuomo doing what he does best there, delivering great sound bites and pointing the finger at someone else.
Bill de Blasio. It's always Bill de Blasio. But I mean, that's the thing, the tragedy of this situation, Chaz, is for those that believe that police are violent thugs, they see plenty of evidence of it. For those that believe that black folks are lawless thieves, they've seen evidence of it. Yeah. That's the worst thing about this, because you get the sense of we're being, driven into prejudiced corners. Yeah. And, are the peaceful protests during the daytime enough to counteract the insanity that we're seeing after dark?
You're so right. And we should remember that there are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of interactions going on every single night. Yeah. There were 10 videos every day doing the rounds, as you say, 5 on either side, and people acting as if that was representing all cops and all protesters. Yeah.
And then there are other videos of, protesters giving police slabs of free water bottles, police taking a knee, all that. And there's been some magnificent stuff going on.
Well, that's what took over in the next couple of days, because things were teetering precariously at that point. He had criminals being potentially confronted by not the best trained police forces. Let's be honest. This was the Atlanta police's attempt to clear crowds without checking the wind first. Well done,
Rookie
guys.
mistake.
That's right. In fact, even protest supporters were copping some treatment at one point.
Looks like they're just finishing up now.
Why are you... We're on your side! We're on your side! Holy shit! We're on your side! We're on your side!
Oh dear. But then, thankfully, as you say, things took a turn for the better in a big way. Yep. Police tried some de-escalation tactics, and they seemed to work because protesters were responding, some great photos, as you said. Looters seem to have mostly given up recently, so over 9,300 arrests later, maybe everyone has pulled back from the brink. Maybe, fingers crossed. And if they have, that would be great, because the legacy of the last 3 months, not just from this, but also from COVID, are a lot of gun sales. Look at that there. 3 near record gun sale months in a row. That's reassuring, isn't it, John?
It's good to see businesses booming, at least for the gun shop owners. Yeah. Look, let's get a legal opinion on what's been going on in the last week or so. Bennett Capers is a former assistant US attorney and professor of law at Brooklyn Law School, specialising in race and criminal justice issues. Professor Capers, thank you for joining us on the Fireside Chat.
Thanks for having me.
Can you explain to us what are the rights legally of peaceful protesters, such as we saw in Lafayette Park this week, who end up being shot with tear gas, rubber bullets and flashbang grenades, apparently just so the president can go and get a photo opportunity at a church?
Unfortunately, they may not have a lot of recourse. So under our First Amendment, obviously protesters have the right to assemble. They have the right to express their views, but the government also can narrowly constrain where they protest, the timing of the protest. So the government can order them to disperse if, for example, they don't have a permit in advance. So for me, I'm not optimistic that those protesters really have much recourse. I see a couple of issues. One, whether using tear gas is reasonable force, and I think, unfortunately, some courts would say it's reasonable force. The other thing is, obviously, it's going to be pretty much impossible, I would think, to identify the individual military members involved. And third, in terms of the government itself, like the government basically has complete immunity in this country. So unfortunately, I don't see the protesters having much recourse.
And what about the legalities of the president's threat to use the US military if city and state officials can't quell protests with police or the National Guard? Can the president literally send in the Marines?
It's legal. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. So the governors of states have the authority to bring in the National Guard of their states, basically, to assist the police in situations where the police need more help. And lots of governors of lots of states are already doing that, including the governor of Minnesota. But that's very different than the president of the United States, President Trump, stepping in and using his authority under an act from 1807 to basically federalize the National Guard and have the National Guard operate at his direction in the states. It's been done before. It's been done several times, most recently in 1992 in response to the LA riots that you might recall. But every time it's been done so far, it's been with the consent of the governors of the states. The other thing to keep in mind is the National Guard, by my estimates, is about 25% people of color who know the brunt of racism and the brunt of unequal policing. So the idea of the National Guard coming in when you have such a high percentage of the National Guard who is going to be extremely sympathetic to the protesters in itself is going to be problematic.
Now, people may have seen the George Floyd video and assume that the cop with his knee on George Floyd's neck is going to jail, but it doesn't often work out like that. How is it that the police can so often seem to get away with what seems like an obvious crime?
That's the problem. I mean, there's so many problems with what we call policing the police in this country. One problem has to do with basically the leeway we give officers in using force. And a lot of that comes from the Supreme Court. You may have heard talk about immunity for police officers. So it's very hard to bring a civil action against a police officer. And in terms of criminal action, in this country, prosecutors basically hold a monopoly on criminal prosecutions. So no matter how much victims may want a charge brought against the police, they have to get buy-in from prosecutors. And prosecutors have a symbiotic relationship with the police officers. Even if an individual prosecutor thinks that police officers may have crossed the line into criminality, it's hard for the prosecutor to bring charges against the same police department that it relies on for its cases. So that's one of the problems. Also keep in mind that prosecutors in this country, for the most part, are elected. The way traditionally people have won elections to be prosecutors is by being tough on crime, running on being a friend of police departments, and running with the support of police unions.
Okay, so given that, how likely do you think it is that the kneeling officer, Derek Chauvin, is going to go to jail?
So to be quite honest, I think a lot of people are wondering, at least a lot of criminal justice scholars are wondering if this is a legitimate case or if it's window dressing, if the fix is already in, as some people have put it. So the charges against the officer included a description of the cause of death that seemed rather a lukewarm description, saying that sure, it was a homicide, but there were multiple causes, including the pre-existing conditions of the victim, which is at odds with what the medical examiner hired by the family found, where he ruled like the death was asphyxiation caused by the officer. There are other issues with the actual charges that I've heard, where it almost seems like the charges are set up to fail. And again, this raises a question of having prosecutors prosecute police officers. Are they giving it 100% or are they not? You may have heard the expression, I don't know whether it exists in all common law countries or not, that a prosecutor can indict a ham sandwich. And basically the same thing is true here. It goes both ways. If a prosecutor wants a case to result in a conviction, the prosecutor can do everything possible to make sure that happens. If a prosecutor wants a case to result in an acquittal, a prosecutor can also do that very easily. And it's very hard for anybody on the outside to do anything about that because we give prosecutors complete discretion and there's very little transparency of what prosecutors are thinking and how they're thinking it, and almost no outside checks.
Professor Bennett Capers, thanks for joining us on a Fireside Chat.
Thank you for having me.
It was also revealed earlier this week, Chaz, that George Floyd, in fact, tested positive to the coronavirus back in early April. A reminder, of course, that not only are African Americans disproportionately the victims of police brutality, but but of this pandemic as well. Black people are 3 times as likely to die of this disease as white people are in America.
We are going to come back to that, but there's actually another group likely to die of COVID, John, and that's Brazilians. America now has fewer daily new cases than Brazil and fewer daily deaths than Brazil. The bad news is that that's more because Brazil is getting worse than because America is getting better. This is the trend in daily cases. As you can see, the 7-day average is going down over time. It is, but really not very quickly lately. It has hit a bit of a plateau recently. And the 7-day average in new deaths has also hit a plateau recently, although it was dropping a lot more rapidly than cases were before the plateau. There are now 4 states that meet the federal government's supposed official criteria for beginning the reopening process. They are New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and New Mexico. But a worrying amount of red on that map, John. Those are the places that aren't even close. But one more thing I wanted to discuss with you about COVID, like you were referring to before with black people, where COVID isn't going away, and you would think that this wouldn't be a great time for hundreds of thousands of people, many minorities, to gather closely together in their cities screaming a lot, even if many of them are wearing masks, which they are. Yet 1,200 health professionals have just responded with an open letter in which they say, white supremacy is a lethal public health issue that predates and contributes to COVID-19, and that, in their view, protests against systemic racism must be supported, which, because they said racism has impacts on both COVID and healthcare outcomes generally, and so they advised people to prepare for an increased number of infections in the days following the protests, even though they support the protests. So what do you think of this? These are health professionals saying, go out and protest, because racism is more important than COVID. These are health professionals.
This is creating a ripe situation for a test in hypocrisy from both sides, left and right now, because we saw all the arguments a month, 6 weeks ago against the protesters who were against the mandatory lockdown orders, saying, let us out. Those that stormed the State House in Wisconsin with guns bared. Funny how the police didn't kneel on their necks, but still, there's been some interesting double standards in all of this. Now, are we going to see the right saying to generally progressive Black Lives Matter protesters, well, you shouldn't be out spreading coronavirus in all these protests, that we should crack down on the peaceful protests as well as the unlawfulness and the unrest? Or whether, in fact, they say, you know what? You're making an informed choice. You're choosing in the middle of a pandemic, which has, as you say, plateaued at the moment, settled down a bit. We're not yet seeing that second wave. So maybe now, this summer, is the time to express those concerns. Have your say in public with these mass demonstrations, the majority of which are overwhelmingly positive and peaceful. If they take that choice, if they, like those health professionals, prioritise making a public statement over potentially their personal health, well, that's okay, except, of course, if they got symptoms, don't go and protest, please.
Absolutely not. I can tell you now, the hypocrisy is definitely being noted by the right. They talk about the protest, as you say, although while it is true that there were no knees or necks when the right-wingers were protesting, there was a difference in that when the left-wingers are protesting, some people, whether they were lefties or otherwise, were smashing police cars, and that's when the police came out in riot gear. So that we should note that. But having said that, I'm not less worried about that hypocrisy. I mean, that's a nice little rhetorical point. For me, it's more a case of, yes, racism does create terrible health outcomes for black people. There's no doubt about that. But what also creates terrible health outcomes is unemployment. And we heard about this a few months back. Suicide, depression, anxiety. A third of America has depression at the moment. That has health outcomes. And that's because of the lockdowns, right? And
if you have no job, you have no health care still.
Exactly.
So it's
exactly. So I think the argument applies for the lockdown just as much as it does for protests. And I also say this assumption they're making that the protest is going to cure racism. Come on. Like, I'm not saying it won't make an impact, but yeah, I don't see a direct line between a protest and curing the problems that black people have with their health outcomes.
But it is a measure
of
a
real reach for me.
Yeah, but it is a measure of the level of concern that people have in the community about this issue and their level of passion. And in an election year, it does make it a top order issue. It has the same impact as maybe a bunch of mass shootings would in terms of making gun control an issue. And don't think for a second that the issue of police violence and the issue of gun control aren't closely related in the United States, just as irreconcilable in some ways, both driven in a lot of cases by white people fearing black people. And there's a long, long, sad history of that.
I will say this, regardless of anything else, the lockdown is clearly over now. After this, there's no way that they can go back and say, and you can't open up your hairdresser. Yeah. There's no way you can do that now. Yeah. It's over.
Well, these nationwide protests we've seen over the death of George Floyd have got the potential to again reshape this year's presidential election, which is just 151 days away, if you're counting. Not only are we seeing President Trump pivoting to a law and order campaign this week, his likely Democratic rival Joe Biden has been grappling with the issue, meeting with protesters and African-American community leaders this week, conspicuously listening more than talking as well.
If people feel our breath has been taken away, and we got to get it back.
As you say, John, Trump at least clearly thinks it's 968 again with his talk of law and order and the silent majority. But I don't think it is 968. When Reuters Ipsos asked people on Monday and Tuesday if they were sympathetic towards the people out protesting now, no, this is after the violence took place, okay? After the violence. People were still sympathetic to the protesters, 64% to 27% who weren't. This is not 968. People aren't scared of protesters anymore. The other thing is that Trump is the worst possible person, according to the polls, to prosecute this case, because consistently for the last year, he's been underwater by 30 points on his ability to appeal on race relations. So even if they think there's a race relation issue going on with the protests and riots and all the rest of it, I don't think they think Trump's the guy to solve it. So that's his problem.
Joe Biden's choice of vice presidential running mate as well has been scrambled by the re-emergence of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. He's already said that he'll choose a woman as his VP. Among those known to be on his shortlist is Senator Amy Klobuchar. She's probably lost the most out of all of this. She's a former prosecutor in Minnesota, of course, where the killing of George Floyd took place. Klobuchar's record in not prosecuting police for brutality has drawn a lot of criticism. The most senior African-American in Congress, Jim Clyburn, saying this week, this is very tough timing for Amy Klobuchar. Indeed it is. Joe Biden is now being urged by some Democrats to pick a black VP as well as a female VP, but there are problems there too. Senator Kamala Harris, for instance, she's a former prosecutor and California Attorney General, earning her the nickname Kamala the Cop from some on the far left. Representative Val Demings, who is also under very serious consideration. She's the former chief of police in Orlando, Florida, at a time when that police force's disproportionate use of force was also under scrutiny. Meanwhile, there were presidential primaries this week in Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Indiana, Washington, D.C., New Jersey, New Mexico and South Dakota. They were awarding delegates to Joe Biden and also Bernie Sanders, despite having ended his campaign. With riots, a pandemic and a lot of mail-in voting going on, we're not getting the full results in, but there are about 700 delegates up for grabs this week. And it is going to put Joe Biden over the top, passing the 1,991 he needs to clinch the nomination. He's currently just shy of that, 1,965, picking up more than 400 delegates this week. Sanders is just over 1,000, adding 35 or so, I think, this week. But the more delegates Bernie Sanders gets, the more influence he'll have on the party rules platform come the convention in August. There is still some doubt, though, Chaz, about whether Bernie's supporters are going to come out and vote for Joe Biden this November. Back in 2016, 12% of Sanders supporters in the primaries voted for Trump in the general election. And that alone, numerically, was the difference between Hillary Clinton winning or losing the election. In Wisconsin, 51,000 Sanders voters crossed party lines to vote for Trump. In Michigan, 47,000 Sanders supporters flipped to Trump in a state that Trump won by just 10,000. In Pennsylvania, 116,000 Bernie supporters voted for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton, more than double Trump's victory margin there. Now, Joe Biden does not want to see a repeat of that, and a poll released about a month ago now, 3 weeks after Bernie dropped out of the race, showed 77% of Bernie supporters were going to vote for Joe Biden, 4% saying they will vote for Trump, 8% a third-party candidate, the Greens, 2% say they won't vote, 8% say they do not know. Big question as to what they're going to do. On Wednesday's Planet America, we did speak to Ben Jealous, the former head of the NAACP, about the protests and the unrest in America. But Ben is also a prominent Bernie Sanders supporter, himself a former Democratic candidate for Governor of Maryland. So we also talked a bit about the political impact of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations for the election in November, as well as hopes for party unity against Donald Trump.
I think one thing is that support for Biden is going up. You know, Donald Trump has tried to adopt the slogan of Richard Nixon, being a law and order president. The difference is Richard Nixon could credibly convince voters in the suburbs that he was a stabilizing force. At this point, President Trump really looks like Captain Chaos, including to a lot of people who had supported him the first time around. And so Biden has an opportunity to really present himself as a stabilizing force. At the same time, I think it's critical that he not do what we did the last time around and get sort of a kind of inoffensive, not really newsworthy vice president, but actually get a vice president who speaks to the younger generation and their aspirations and their frustrations. And so that's his opportunity, is to, quite frankly, choose a vice president who will really excite the young people of this country and give them hope that their voices will be heard and that their aspirations can be achieved.
Ben, Bernie Sanders, who you supported for the presidency throughout the primaries, is advocating for a much bigger role of government in the lives of American people in so many of the areas that we've touched on. He's not going to be the nominee, yet at least 20-25% of his supporters currently say they're not going to support Joe Biden, who is going to be the nominee. Is it time for Biden to just give up on those people and say, look, they're going to stay at home, I'll never get them to vote for me?
I think there's a good chance that folks will come around. There's a certain mourning period at the end of a primary, and we've got a lot of days in front of us. And it's a good sign that he's reached out to people like AOC and pulled her in to help him think deeply about how we, for instance, deal with climate change head on. So I'm hopeful that Joe Biden will continue to get stronger as a candidate and build a coalition that's capable of winning this fall.
The week had some more worrying polls for President Trump as well. A new one from Monmouth University had Joe Biden surging to an 11-point national lead. Once that was added to the average of polls, Biden is almost 8 points clear. Now, for context, Hillary Clinton led Trump by under 4 points at this stage in 2016, and Obama led by just over 2 points at this stage against both John McCain and Mitt Romney. George W. Bush trailed John Kerry by almost 1.5 points and did manage to come back as incumbent. So Trump is a lot further behind than that. He needs to double his turnaround of 4 years ago to even get close. These are very concerning polls for President Trump. And I know what you're thinking. National polls do not matter. It is the swing states. Well, they're just as bad, if not worse, as far as Trump supporters are concerned. According to a Fox News poll this week, Biden has opened a 9-point lead in Wisconsin, which many see as a tipping point state in November. Win there, and you've almost certainly already won Michigan and Pennsylvania. But look at that. Biden is leading in Arizona, which has been on the Democrats' radar for a long time, but they've only won it once in 70 years, in '96 with Bill Clinton's re-election. And here's an even bigger worry for Donald Trump. Ohio, the Buckeye state. It is within the margin of error, but he's trailing by 2 in a state that he won by 8. And history says no Republican has ever won the White House without winning Ohio.
I'll tell you the most worrying poll of all I saw during this week. 51% of people say that Joe Biden has the mental acuity to be an effective president. 46% said Trump did. How would you be getting outdone by Joe Biden on mental sharpness?
That's interesting, isn't it?
But look, I know we're way out of time, but just a couple of quick updates. First of all, hydroxychloroquine studies, we've talked about them endlessly. There was a big one a couple of weeks ago we talked about, which had 98,000 people involved. Turns out the data was wrong, if not fraudulent, and that study's been completely retracted. That does not mean you should run out and take hydroxychloroquine, because there's lots of studies that say it still doesn't work. But the big one, that has been retracted.
That was one that actually said it kills more people than not giving them anything.
Exactly.
Okay, that's a dud.
So forget that. And secondly, the charges against the cop that knelt on George Floyd have actually been upgraded from 3rd-degree murder to 2nd-degree murder. I don't have the time to explain it to you right now, but I will explain it to you on the podcast and explain some solutions to this whole police crisis right there.
But we are out of time. Join us for another Fireside Chat same time next week and on Wednesday night, 9:30 p.m. on ABC TV for Planet America. But till then, good night.